geared towards newbies, right? And part of the goal is to help people avoid some of the pitfalls, because Angular does a lot of black magic sort of under the covers.
Does newbies mean upper management?
Yes.
Careful what you answer.
But I also want to discuss sort of what the like model API is like in Angular. I know like Knockout and Backbone, they have like actual model classes or APIs. Like I think Backbone, it's backbone.model. Whatever. I haven't used either one of those, but Angular is sort of strangely missing this. And I think a lot of people when they come to it new, they're wondering like, this is supposed to be an MV star, an MVC or whatever. Where's the model? Where are the controllers? I've also seen people get confused by like ng model, which is just a directive that doesn't actually do, it's not actually related to the model at all, right? So those are the goals. I think also some people, when they first come to Angular, they expect it to kind of be like jQuery. We're all like very jQuery infused in the JavaScript world, and I think that can trip you up, right? If you go and look for something like document.onReady, there's no sort of equivalent in Angular. In fact, I think, this is just a guess, I believe Angular uses the onReady to start kicking off its compilation. So you shouldn't think of it as being like jQuery. It doesn't solve problems for you like cross-browser and dot manipulation and stuff in the way that jQuery does. So what is it? I think of it as like either, I've heard the authors call it a domain-specific language for DOM. And I think what they mean by that is that you're writing functionality for the DOM that manipulates the DOM, right in the DOM, right? And it's very like DOM aware. So it's sort of like attaching a bit of JavaScript functionality to the DOM. And of course, it's also just like a JavaScript MVC framework. One other thing I want to mention before we get going is I won't be able to get to everything I wanted to get to today. I was really hoping to cover directives. I think directives are like super core to what Angular is. And most of what I'm talking about today is like still in the context of directives. Like anytime you're doing data binding or event binding, you're basically doing it through a directive. It's not necessarily a custom directive, but it's a directive. And if you understand, the more you understand of what's going on underneath the covers with directives, the more easily you'll be able to like get yourself out of that hole when you find a pitfall or whatever. If anybody's, I don't know if people are listening on the bridge or if they're using Join Me, please just speak up if you can't hear or if you have a question. Just shout out your questions, please. If it's too off topic, I'll just kind of breeze it over. But I'd rather people be on board, right? So two resources you can go to. If you can understand everything on this page, you're good to go, right? If you can just grok all this stuff, that's all you need to know, really. One other really important resource, though, is this writing directives talk that Misko, the author, or one of the authors, the main author of Angular did. I don't know where this was, but if you find the talk with him in the upper left corner there on writing directives, it's really really helpful. So before I start talking about sort of the DOM and some of that stuff, I just want to mention that I've heard, I think Misko, I'm not sure if it was that talk or another one, but he mentioned that these are the things that he thinks of as the core concepts. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to be talking about these mostly today and how they relate to the model. But also before we get going, I think I should just mention services really briefly. I don't want to focus on too much, but they are pretty cool, but they're really simple too, right? So it's just, services are just kind of like dependency injection, right? So I'm also coding during this, which is probably a bad idea, but it's definitely unadvisable, but I'm doing it anyway. So the services basically are these, go ahead.
Can you crank up the font size?
Oh, yeah. Is that good?
Yeah.
Cool. So all these dollar, these arguments that start with dollars they are injected into typically controllers or directive controllers or into the directive definition itself. They're all called services, and basically they're just a little lightweight version of sort of dependency injection or inversion control. They're not like a full-blown, it's not like Spring, right? Everything's just a singleton. The documentation states singleton objects are functions that carry out specific tasks. Dan, how do you put it? You say like global singletons or something?
Yeah. If it's something being injected, a global singleton, you're always referring to the same one.
Yeah, and you can author your own, right? Right, so that gets us to the sort of the model that I want to talk about. So the first thing we have to understand is this idea of Angular scopes, right? So they're distinct from what you'd normally think of as a scope in JavaScript, right? But they're conceptually similar to the programming idea, just the general computer science idea of what a scope is. Only they're, again, like more DOM specific, right? So the way these are implemented is basically most directives that you wire up, like the ng controllers here, also provide a scope, right? And they are inherited or encapsulated within one another in the same way that you would think of like a function. In JavaScript, only a function defines a scope, but a function within a function within a function, right? So that the scope associated with slide controller can access all of the objects associated with main controller scope, and then there's also a root scope, which is the parent of all these that they can all get to. And that's implemented through prototypal inheritance. If everybody ever, I think, well, if people aren't familiar with prototypal inheritance, it's just the JavaScript way of doing sort of a hacked inheritance. But basically, if there's an object that's on the root scope, and you try to access it in this slide controller scope, it's just going to bubble up through the prototypes until it finds something that has the name of the variable that you're looking for. Is that clear to everybody? Because I can demonstrate that really quickly. Maybe I'll just do that. So I have on the main controller here, I've wired up a variable. Just says hello from main controller, and then this is up above slide controller. And just to demonstrate how that works, I can just log scope dot some variable here, and it should just come straight through. So see hello from main controller at the bottom here. A couple little tricks. Any questions so far? Anyone lost? Another nice thing to know is that scopes each have a unique ID. So if you're ever unsure of like where you are, like you're trying to go through this prototype chain, you can always go up through the prototype chain and like check IDs. So this ID in the slide controller should match the ID of the main controller. We should see those. They're both 3. Another thing to note is that when you're go ahead.
So are the IDs sequential? Do they?
I'm not sure. They're just guaranteed to be unique, and yeah, that's it. They seem to change. I don't know if I'm not sure. I mean, I imagine if you wire a directive into the middle of those two, it'll probably bump the child up or something. Another thing to know, but that I can't really get too far into right now, is that there's this idea of a scope.parent. And what scope.parent comes from is directives when you're trying to do transclusion, right? So basically just know that when you have a directive and it uses transclusion, which most do, or a lot of them do, I shouldn't say most, but I know like ngRepeat does, and most custom directives that I've written have, although maybe that was wrong, but basically what happens is the transcluded content, so everybody, I don't know if people know what I mean by transclusion, but basically it's putting content within a DOM element, right? So you're gonna wire this directive into the DOM, but you want to be able to include content inside that DOM, but that content inside that element, right? The content that's inside that element should have access to the parent, right? So maybe I should just wire up a quick example so it's clear to everybody. So you might have like some directive, right? And then I want to be able to wire up some variable here, right? And it should be able to, okay, I have it right. It should be able to access some variable, from main controller, right? But it would be like bad version of encapsulation if setting some variable in the scope of some directive were to clobber some variable, right, on the parent scope, right? So basically, this content that's injected from main controller into like the child of some directive here is said to be transcluded, right? And you need this parent. This parent pointer actually comes from the fact that the scope of some directive and the scope of its child are actually going to be siblings, right? So only the scope here, ASDF some variable, is going to actually be prototypally inherited from the scope of main controller, but the scope of some directive will have a scope.parent, so you can still get up to main controller and access anything you need. So like a lot of times when you do like an integer repeat, you're going to need to do scope.parent.parent, whatever, to get up to, if you have like an integer repeat and an integer repeat and you're trying to access something there. That's why you need to go through the .parent. I think that was pretty confusing when I first came to it. Like, they're prototypal inherited, but I have to go through this parent. Like, it didn't make sense. I don't think I'll be able to get to transclusion today. I'll try if we have a lot of time at the end. I can try to do it, but watch that video, and he covers it very well. So scopes, anything else? I think that's everything with scopes. So scope.watch. I think this is probably the most important function that that's part of Angular's API. This is how it does what I call like model propagation. Basically, you know, you want to have robust decoupled code that accesses the model, combines it in some way or whatever, and displays it into the view, right? And most of the way that Angular does it is through this scope.watch. So how does it work? The first argument to scope.watch is an expression. I'll get to expressions later, but typically I actually use functions quite a bit. It can just be any function. And all that's going to happen is Angular repeatedly calls this expression or this function, and anytime that the return value changes, it caches the result of that call. Anytime it changes, then it fires off your listener, right? The model then is just plain old JavaScript object. So this is very different, I think, from Knockout and Backbone, right? Knockout and Backbone, you have to like specifically say, like, this is my model, and I think it does like some change listener, so you can change it, but like the DOM automatically fires some change event. I'm not sure about the details. This is very different than the other ones. I think they call this dirty checking, right? And as it, like, so every time you fire off a listener, you might change something in your model, which changes the result of a different watch expression, right? So basically it just keeps churning through this, what they call the digest loop, until these things stabilize, right? And you can get into all sorts of weird little issues where you make like an infinite loop, right? So your listener changes the model, and that model fires off a listener that changes the model that fires the previous listener, right? And you get into an infinite loop, and you'll get an error in the thing. It'll only go like 10 digest loops deep, and it'll say, like, listen, the digest loop is not ending, you probably did something wrong. So that's what that means. I think a lot of people think this is bad for performance. It's a valid argument. I'm not necessarily going to argue against it. I don't think I'm qualified. I would say, like, premature optimization is the root of all evil. I would also point people to this response from Misko on Stack Overflow, where he discusses this question. He complains a bit about change listeners in Knockout and Backbone, and he discusses performance. I'm going to host this on all these slides will be on my website at claytonrabenda.com/Angular also. So if you can't find this, you should be able to just search for data binding in Angular.js and find that post. Basically, his argument boils down to, if you're showing so many things on the screen that you're having a problem with this digest loop, your UI is not consumable by humans. So you shouldn't be showing that many things to a person, right? And if that's your problem, then you've got another problem that you should be solving, not trying to optimize your dirty checking or whatever. Any questions? Everybody with me? So what did I want to say here? Right, I did want to show people sort of how this scope.watch can really I really like it because it gives you a real like robustness to your application, right? So one thing I like to do, I know a lot of people probably use the route provider. I don't really like doing that. Instead, I like to just manually watch I do a scope.watch on the location service, which just returns the URL here, and I inspect the URL for like changes, and when I see a change, I propagate that out to the view. So this is actually what I'm doing here. This slide number is just being watched, and I'm actually just including a template based on that slide number. It was animating earlier. I seem to have broken it. Maybe we'll fix that later. But there's no page refreshes happening here, right? I wired in an animation to demonstrate that, but there's actually no page refresh, right? This is all just happening client side. Just to show people how I'm implementing that. And this is a pattern that I like to use. I don't know, you might think that this is wrong. I typically do some sort of validation in my watch. This might be a bit silly, right? Because you could just put the expression in here instead. You could just put a string, which resolves to, well, I'll get to that when I talk about the parse service, but the parse service itself is very robust. So if you just put an expression in here, it typically will do some, well, it doesn't do the validation, but it'll always return to you a nice clean return value, and it won't throw an exception at your face, like just because you don't have an index into some array or something like that. So basically all I'm doing here is I'm watching the location service, $search, .slide. I'm parsing that as an int and making sure that it falls within the bounds here. This is a little much. You don't even need to do that, right? I'm returning it as an int, and then so long as it's not null, I change the slide template. So I should show you what this looks like in index.html here. So there's just an ng include, and this is wired up with a variable called slide template. And then I have the ng controller here wired up as slide controller. So slide controller just does a scope.watch that we were discussing, and in the listener function I set the slide template. This is supposed to be doing that animation that's broken. Right, because I broke it on purpose to show you guys. I'll explain why that timeout is needed. That has to do with the digest loop. But yeah, you can see that there's, it looks kind of cool, right? That was Dan's idea to add animation in there. So I think that's everything I wanted to discuss with scope.watch. Are there any questions about scope watch real quick? Because I think it's really core. If anybody has any. Okay. Let's see. I did want to show you the user widget. Another nice thing about this is it's sort of robust against like time-dependent sort of things. So if your events are firing in an order, which you don't have to predict what order things are going to happen in, right? There's no like, it gets rid of sort of race condition errors and problems like that. So I've wired up a little user controller, a user widget. So I've got this right-hand side here. I'm going to make like a little demonstration of some things, right? So I've wired up this little user widget, like as if you were like logging into the site. And as part of that, I have a fake little HTTP request. Well, it's not fake, it's doing an actual HTTP request, but I've wired in an extra 2-second delay. So you can see that when this user is null, right, it doesn't display this. But as soon as the user becomes not null, it just, like, the ng switch statement that's in this widget just begins working, right? So I'm just switching on user.loggedin. The nice thing about it is that this user.loggedin, normally you would get an error, right, if you tried to access this through JavaScript, because user is null, right? But because of the way that it's actually the parse, so I should just start talking about the parse service. But you can also, another nice thing is like you can mix and match these, right? So I can wire up another directive here, which is also like another data binding directive, right? So ng switch and ng show are both kind of like data binding, and it will not show anything until that 2 seconds, until the HTTP request has come back and the user is set, right?
Can you explain what you did here again?
Yeah. So if you look. I'll just show it, right? So when I first load the page, it says, welcome to Clay's Angular demo. And then when the user gets set, 2 seconds later, you see this. But you can, it's just showing, how you can kind of combine the ng switch on user.loggedin and the user, and the ng show also on the user, and they just kind of work nice together. It has more to do with the parse service, I guess, than it does with scope.watch, but anyway. So the parse service also, I think, is really core. This is a really strange one too because the docs are so cryptic, right? So scope.watch is sort of, it gives you an MVC, right? But it's still in JavaScript world. We're not like, we haven't bridged the gap to the DOM yet, right? So the parse service basically takes strings and gives us a way to talk from the DOM into our Angular scope.watches, right? And a lot of the data binding directives, whatever, ng repeat, ng switch, ng if, ng show, ng bind, obviously. Oftentimes they're just some combination of a scope.watch and a parse with a little bit of JavaScript mixed in. So what does the parse service actually do, right? So if you look at the very cryptic documents, they have this getter that they set by calling parse, and they pass it a string user.name, right? There's also a setter here. I've never used it. I know Dan said he's never used it. I don't know if you guys on the platform team have used it, but I don't know what it's for. But basically, the way that the parse service is typically used, or the way that it's used, at least in the context of thinking about the model, is that it returns a function. When you call that function with a scope, here they're calling it context, right? So just think of this context as being like what your scope is. So you have scope.user.name equals Angular, right? So when you call this, the function that parse returns with the string user.name, and you call that with the context here, right? So that's equivalent to $parse username, and then call that with context, which is usually a scope. Then it'll return the string Angular to you, right? Because scope.user.name is Angular. So what this allows you to do basically is all these, everything in the DOM is really just a string, right? So let's not talk about ngClick, but ngBind, for example, if you were to say ngBind some variable, right? It would look for that name, some variable, parse that in the current scope context. So to give you an idea, I can show you, let me see. Right, so the curly braces are kind of similar. I don't know, this maybe isn't the best example. Maybe I should have just done an ngBind. I guess I could try that real quick. I think if I just bind, Dan, is this right? If I bind like this, it's equivalent to the curly brace like this. All right, let's see what this does. Or actually, no, this is not where I want to play. So I actually have, right here, I've bound the slide index into a little, like, kind of page number here. Oh, and I should also show you, when I'm using the, I forgot to mention this before, when I treat the URL as a model, it gives you a lot of side benefits, like, you get automatic back button support. The validation that I was doing makes it kind of robust, so like if I give it an invalid URL, it can just fail nicely and go back to slide 0. And you can also, of course, deep link into there, right? But I just want to show you real quick a bit of data binding through the parse service here. So I guess most people probably are familiar with the curly brace data binding, right? And this is sort of just like another directive, right? And in order to demonstrate that, I wrote up a little directive that I'm calling curly. This has, the actual curly braces have a nice benefit that they can be wired directly into an attribute, right? So you can say like attribute, whatever, equals curly like this, sorry, right? Whereas you couldn't do that with my fake curly directive, right? But just to show you what's happening under the covers, I've wired this up real quick. So this actually isn't working in its current state. Right now, maybe I left it working. I may have left it working. It doesn't.
You're just that good.
Yeah, I meant to leave it broken and show you guys how to fix it, but right, I did leave it working. So originally I had it just be going through the parse service, right, like this, right. So I look at the contents of the curly, which is the string, some variable. I pass it through the parse in the current scope, right? And this is going to bubble up to the main scope where I have defined some variable, right? And then I assign the HTML into the curly, right? So this is almost like a curly, except it doesn't work, right? It gives you -1, which is if you remember, I don't know if you guys noticed, this is the value that I set the slide index to in the controller originally. So it's not tracking the slide as I go, right? So you can see slide index. I'm actually setting it in this watch listener here, but it's not changing, right? It didn't pick up the 6 here, and it doesn't change if I hit max, right?
Do you have the call to curly again? What did you pass in and what happened there?
So in the index, I just have a curly directive wired up, and in the inside, I've written the name of the variable slide index. So again, if you're looking in this directive here, when the link function fires, it grabs the HTML out of the element, right? So watch me is going to be the string slide index, and then we're going to parse it, right? So this is like equivalent to saying parse slide index, right? Which is sort of equivalent to like scope slide index, right? It's actually exactly the same, right? I could just do that. One reason that people don't use, right? You don't use bracket notation is that this is more robust. Like you can do like just complete garbage here, right? You can do objects that don't exist and try to reference their children, and you won't get an exception, right? You'll just get, I think, an undefined or a null back. You can also do expressions, and I think Dan, I don't know how serious he is about it, he might do another talk on expressions. So you can do like 1 + 1 in here, right? And I guess obviously then, you know, the scope doesn't matter. This could just be whatever. Or you can do like 1 plus some int, right? Those all work. But in the context of the DOM, right, I'm just really interested in sort of just watching things that are wired up in the DOM here. Or sorry, in the context of the model, I'm only interested in watching things that are wired up in the DOM. So the way to make this work, right, to make it track the changes, you just have to combine the two ideas, right? So you combine a scope.watch with a parse, right? So in this case, we're still doing the same lines, only instead of assigning directly from the parse into new content, we're just watching the parsed watch me, and then the variable here will just come through with the new content. Right? So this should repair it, right? You can see it changes here.
So this is exactly what happens in the normal double curly braces directive? This is just like...
Yeah, I think, I mean, I haven't actually looked at the documentation for curly, but I imagine it's very similar, right? There's a compile service that runs that walks through the whole DOM. It looks for any directives, and it fires the directives compiling and linking functions. And I imagine that curly is just like a special case. Like it's it's like a special directive that is provided by Angular. You can't write ones like that. Like if you were writing a directive, you can only wire it up on a DOM element. But I imagine it under the covers it looks just like this. Right. So I think, is everybody clear like how you can get sort of a data binding? You're going to take your model, you're going to watch it, and you're going to propagate it out to the view using the combination of scope.watch and parse, right? Scope.apply, right? So the other side of the coin is event binding, right? So you're going to do things like ng-click, and you want those events to change the DOM, and then you're going to use this event, the data binding, through parse and watch to propagate that out to the DOM. So the way that that's done is sort of similar, but it uses this idea of a scope.apply. So what a scope.apply is a function that basically kicks off that digest loop, right? So it's not like I think Dan, I should have mentioned this earlier, but Dan was saying like some game developers might think that the digest loop is like a constant, like a game loop that's just always firing. It's not that at all. The digest loop only fires when there's an event that Angular knows might affect the model, right? So this is why, like, you can't just wire up a normal jQuery click event and change the model and expect it to work. I don't know if anybody has. I think everyone who comes to Angular from jQuery has probably tried to do that and been very confused. Like, I changed my model and I bound it into the DOM. Like, what the heck's going on here? It didn't work. And this can also create like all sorts of little Heisenbugs, right? So in order, I have a nice little demonstration of the sort of Heisenbug that you can very easily create using Angular. So again, I have, well, let me see if that works. Right, so there's the ng bind, right? So that's again similar to the curly braces or the curly directive, right? Ng bind. Again, it just looks at the attribute ng bind, finds the value in there, which is the name of a variable, and parses it and watches it, right? So there's that string that I set in main controller. And what I have here is an ng click that fires an event, or fires a listener called change the content, right? And what change the content does is simply changes content. It just resets some variable to a different value, right? So it says hello from ng click, right? So if I click this, you'll see it changes the model, it fires the scope.apply, and then the data binding in ng bind propagates that out to the view. I also have another link wired up here, which fires just the jQuery button, right? So I just have, this is like the old school jQuery way of doing a click handler. I just have an ID on this element. And wow, am I out of time already?
We're so excited.
Oh no, sorry,
2 minutes.
20 minutes, sorry, I thought it ended at 4. So this is just a normal click handler, right? But you'll see that obviously, because there's no digest loop being kicked off here, it doesn't do anything, right? But the funny thing is, you'll see these sort of Heisenbugs where if I click it, you can see it actually did come through in this case, right? So if I click it in the first 2 seconds, I don't know if anybody can tell me what's going on here, right? So I can actually click it and move the mouse away, and you'll see it changed. Exactly, yeah. So the HTTP response, right, that's happening from here, this success function is actually firing off another scope.apply. So once that scope.apply hits, it starts calling all the watch things. It sees this ng binds like under the covers. The ng bind has, you know, some scope.watch, and the change finally comes out. So I think a lot of people, when they come to Angular, they're like, they run into these sort of things where it's like, that was working yesterday and I made this little change and now it stopped working. And it's usually something related to this whole digest loop, like where it's not kicking off at the time when you expected it to.
Is there something that you can do in jQuery to kind of make it always run apply?
Yeah.
Or change or something?
Right. Sorry. Yes, that's what I was going to get to. So, right, the obvious fix here is to just put a scope.apply here. You can call it, like you can do it like this. You can just call scope.apply afterwards. I believe this will work. Right? Changes immediately. I should hide that other thing because it's just really confusing. The reason Misko says that you shouldn't do that is that it hides errors. I think Dan said he's actually seen that happen. So it works, but it's recommended that you instead do a scope.apply and pass it a function that does what you want it to do. Like this, right? And that should work too. I'm not sure why that's recommended actually, but that is what they recommend. It has something to do with handling exceptions. Right.
But is
I
there
did
a
also
way to do a catch-all type of thing where any function call from jQuery is preceded by an apply? Not recommended?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what ng-click is, right? So ng-click is like, that's the event binding. The event binding directives all sort of do that, right? So that's why I wired up like, I wired up like a swipe directive, right, for the apps that I wrote. So we're using the Hammer library to do event binding to the swipe events. And all it is just you just look for that event, and then exactly like I'm describing, you just parse it and scope.apply it, right? So if you had some event that you were firing all the time like that, then you would want to just wire it up with some sort of directive that just does something like that. Other places where this occurs are like in like the HTTP response, like I was mentioning. Also, this timeout, like this is why you use timeout, or one of the reasons you use timeout instead of set timeout, right? Because if you use a set timeout, that's just an event coming from the DOM, or from the browser, right? The browser's like, oh, 2 seconds passed, fire this event now. And Angular has no idea that that happened. So that's why they wrap it with this $timeout. $timeout also is very useful because it always fires, it's guaranteed to fire after the current digest loop. So that's a really nice trick that I like to use. And that's related to the reason that that animation wasn't working before. That was why I needed that timeout there. Because what's happening is the slide holder is actually inside the content of these slides, right? So if you look at slide 1, for instance, the slide holder is right here. So what's happening is I'm changing, let me see if I can get this right. I'm changing the slide template up here. And that's kicking off a digest loop that's going to update the template. But before, why does that not work actually? I guess before it's finishing, I thought that the show time, so the show template is actually wired up to the onload of the ng input. So you would think that it would not fire that until, right, it has to do an HTTP request to fetch the content, right? So the slide is actually in template/slide1 or whatever. It does an XML HTTP request to get that. The digest loop that's going to get kicked off from the response from that HTTP does not get kicked off until some delay, right? So there's like one digest loop to change the slide template and fire that HTML HTTP request. Then that digest loop is done, and I guess, yeah, I don't know why it fires this show template before then. You'd think that it would wait for the response to come back. Anybody? I thought I had this in my head before I came today, but anyway, the timeout fixes it, right? So just know that throwing timeouts some places will solve things sometimes.
Thanks.
And it's definitely related to the order of the digest loops, right? Like, I don't think they're guaranteed to necessarily run in any order because it's just firing all these watch statements, right? And they could be resolving in any sort of order. Right. So I was hoping to get to directives a bit, but we're basically down to 15 minutes. I mean, I can do that. Does anybody have any questions, or should I attempt to talk about directives for 15 minutes? Which is way too ambitious. Like I can't. There's no way.
That's the coolest feature of Angular.
It is the coolest feature of Angular. I guess I can start, but I'll have to awkwardly stop like halfway.
Oh, so this recipe wasn't awkward?
Oh man.
I'm just a heckler guy.
Adi was confused by ng model, so
Yeah.
he's like,
Go for it.
ng model is actually it's a two-way binding, right? So ng model is you wire it up to an input element, right? And it looks for the change events on that input element, and updates. So it goes both ways. It's a data binding and an event binding, right? It looks for the change events, changes the model, and then propagates that out wherever. Actually, I guess it's not. It's really just an event binding, right? But it defines, I think, a model in the scope also. Right. So yeah, Misko calls directives the coolest features of Angular. I think of them sort of as ways of like wiring up a function to the DOM. So the attributes of the directive are sort of like the arguments. And if you're using transclusion, then I kind of think of the inner HTML as like the last argument. And it's like, it gets kind of crazy because it's potentially just this gigantic argument, right? But that's sort of one way that I think about them. I don't really know what a domain-specific language is exactly. I mean, it's a language that's specifically geared towards manipulating the DOM, right? So I think that's sort of why it's super expressive and people seem to like it. I think Knockout does something similar where you can like wire up functionality into the DOM, but it doesn't let you write your own, right? So only Angular lets you write custom directives. So one sort of pitfall associated with directives are these compiling and linking functions. They also have a controller function. I think people don't always know when to use what. I don't know when I would use a controller function. I've never used it. I don't see the point. I mean, I would rather wire up an ng controller on the same, because they're exactly equivalent. If you wire up an ng controller on an element with a directive and that directive has an ng controller, they're going to get the same exact scope and they're going to fire just one after the other. So, I mean, you can use that just like you would use a normal ng controller. And just to further clarify that, like MVC, I think a lot of times the appropriate thing to call the controllers in Angular, although the ng model doesn't really have anything to do with the model, I think ng controller is usually the appropriate place to put like controller logic. And I'd also say that you would put that as far down into the DOM as you can so that like you're reducing coupling, right? So this part of the model is only needed in this part of the DOM. So I would put a controller around that part of the DOM and have any controller sort of, or a scope.watch, which is going to manipulate that part of the model in that controller. But anyway, directives have these two functions, the compiling function and the linking function. I've never had to write a compiling function. They're very rarely used. I think ng repeat is like the quintessential example of when you need a compiling function. And I think ng repeat actually stops the compilation at the point where it is, and it manually compiles everything below it. Basically, what this means is the compiler service runs. It looks through the whole DOM. It finds the directives. It makes a DOM object out of any directives that it sees, and then, like with ng repeat, for example, when it fires the linking function for ng repeat, it takes that DOM object and spits out a copy of it into each, for each item in the ng repeat, in the object that you're repeating on, right? And the linking function is fired at the end when you actually have the particular instance of the DOM element that you're manipulating. So for most things, this is exactly the same, right? Because most things, there's one instance, right? So they won't even look slightly different. Like the actual element, it will be exactly the same in the compiling function and in the linking function. But in a directive like ng repeat, the DOM elements will be completely different. Because like if you look at the arguments to the compiling and linking function, I don't even have a compiling function here, but you don't get the scope, right? You just get the element and the attributes in the compiling function. But this element for most will be exactly equivalent. But for an ng repeat, the element you get from the compiling function is like the template, right? So this is the thing that's going to be spit out n times as you go through the ng repeat. And the element you get for the linking function is the actual specific instance of that template, right? Typically just use the linking function, right? If you're using the compiling function, you're probably doing something wrong. And if you use the compiling function when you shouldn't, and you put that directive into an ng repeat, it'll probably break. I don't know how much time I have.
Like,
Yeah.
I could show a brief thing of Angular expressions.
If you want.
As a pitch for why we wrote
Yeah, if you want to do
this
that.
in 2 weeks' time, perhaps. If you have any free time.
Is there any other questions you want to ask? Yeah, why don't you do that then? So the expressions go through the parse service, but Dan uses them more.
Can I project?
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm only going to talk for like a minute or 2 minutes because we talked a little bit about the parse service, and I'm convinced that is the coolest thing about Angular, and I've been using Angular for a while now. And a lot of time I refer to using the parse service as sort of like a